I'm Paul with Exposure Therapy, and this is how to choose your first portrait lens, part 2, the one where I discuss how to pick an appropriate focal length for portraiture. One of the most discussed and misunderstood properties of portrait lenses is focal length. If you ask your preferred online community for portrait lens suggestions, chances are many users will respond by recommending specific focal lengths. Perhaps the most commonly recommended focal length for portraiture on full-frame cameras is 85mm. Other popular focal lengths include 50mm, 105, and 135mm, and the 70 to 200mm zoom lenses. If you're at all familiar with the concept of focal length, you should notice that most of these suggestions are in the short to medium telephoto range. When explaining their recommendations, photographers claim that wide-angle lenses make faces look bad or that such and such focal length is too wide for portraits. When this sort of sentiment is left as is, the unfortunate implication is that some inherent quality of wide-angle lenses causes ugliness, and that longer focal lengths provide the solution. To help you understand these warnings and suggestions, I'll briefly explain the concept of scale and perspective distortion in photography. In my Composition for Beginners video, I touched upon the concept of scale, which refers to the apparent size of your subject within the photographic frame. Your subject's scale is determined by two factors when you're taking a picture: focal length and perspective. The focal length of a lens determines its magnifying power. This is the apparent size of your subject as it's projected onto the focal plane where your image sensor sits. A longer focal length corresponds to greater magnification and a larger rendition of your subject, and a shorter focal length results in less magnification and a smaller rendition of your subject. The apparent size of a subject at a fixed distance from the camera is directly proportional to the focal length of the lens. So for example, if you photograph a kid holding a beach ball and then switch to a lens that is twice the focal length of the first, the rendered size of every element in your image from the kid to the beach ball will be doubled in size along the linear dimensions, meaning in height and width. That's how focal length affects scale. In photography, perspective is your camera's point of view and is determined exclusively by the position from which a photo is taken. For simplicity, consider this the camera-to-subject distance. Changes in subject distance have an obvious effect on their perceived scale in a photograph. Ask your subject to come closer by half the distance and they'll appear twice as large. Ask them to move twice as far away and they'll appear half as large. That's how perspective affects scale. To maintain an equal subject scale in the frame, the focal length and subject distance must change in a linear fashion, that is, together and in the same direction. So for a given scale, if your subject doubles their distance, you will have to double your focal length to maintain the original scale. If your subject halves their distance, you'll have to half your focal length to maintain the same scale. So for example, if you like the scale of your subject at 50mm, but circumstances force the photo to be taken from half the initial distance, you'll need to use 25mm to obtain the original scale. Unfortunately, shortening the distance to your subject can result in perspective distortion. In photography, perspective distortion is an inevitable consequence of how subject distance affects scale. Objects that are close to the camera appear much bigger relative to objects that are farther away. For example, ginger looks 3 times larger than violet because violet is 3 times farther from the camera. This relationship will hold true whether their distances from the camera are 1 and 3 meters, 5 and 15 meters, or 20 and 60 meters respectively, because in each case, ginger is 3 times closer than violet. This relationship stops being true when the camera starts to change its distance with respect to the subjects whose distances are fixed relative to one another. The disparity in their apparent size will decrease as the camera continues to move further back until these differences become imperceptible. This effect is known as telephoto compression. However, despite its name, it occurs at all focal lengths when a distant subject is visible. Telephoto lenses simply make it more obvious because the telecompressed subjects are shown at a larger scale in the frame. Ginger and Violet's relationship plays out on a smaller scale within the features of a single subject. People aren't flat. We're not cardboard cutouts. Our faces, heads, and bodies have depth and dimension. In a standard portrait, your subject's nose is closer to the camera than their eyes, which in turn are closer than their ears. These differences are relatively inconsequential at longer working distances. However, they become significant at the very close subject distances required to achieve a standard portrait composition when using a wide-angle lens. This leads to perspective distortion, which is characterized by a nose that appears larger than normal in comparison to the rest of the face, a narrower head, and ears that appear pinned back, and from extremely close distances, the cheeks can occlude the ears altogether. The characteristics attributed to perspective distortion are entirely a consequence of the camera-to-subject distance. The focal length of a lens doesn't directly influence perspective. This bears repeating. Focal length does not affect perspective. Despite this, it's often blamed for the effect because different focal lengths are used for different purposes and at varying subject distances. Wide-angle lenses are typically used from shorter distances lest the subject appear too small in the frame, while longer focal lengths are generally used from farther away lest the subject appear too large. Let's dive a bit deeper. You've probably seen this or similar effects before. Here's a famous variation known as the dolly zoom from the movie Jaws. This effect is created by taking your first shot from a close distance and using a short focal length. Take the second shot from slightly further back and with a proportionally longer focal length. Such animations aim to illustrate how different focal lengths affect our perception of apparent facial geometry. Most examples, such as this one by Dan V, label each frame's focal length but omit the subject distance, which is arguably more important since you can't have perspective distortion without changing your perspective. Since focal length doesn't affect perspective, we can illustrate the same effect by varying the camera to subject distance without adjusting the lens. Initially, the distortion is difficult to see because the subject becomes smaller. However, the perspective distortion becomes obvious when cropping each photo to equalize the subject's scale throughout the sequence. Adding distance labels instead of focal lengths creates a much more practical point of reference. When someone suggests a particular focal length is ideal for portraiture, they're really expressing two preferences. One for the relative appearance of facial proportions from a given distance, and another for the subject's scale within a composition. Only you can determine whether you share the same preferences for both. Although there's no ideal universal distance for portrait photography, proxemics, the study of how people unconsciously structure the spaces between themselves and others, can offer several clues about the implication of camera-to-subject distances. Consider the idea of interpersonal distance zones, proposed by Edward T. Hall in 1966. These are divided into the intimate distance from 0 to 45 centimeters, the personal distance from 45 centimeters to 1.2 meters, the social distance from 1.2 meters to 3.7 meters, and the public distance from 3.7 meters and greater. Although these specific ranges are biased towards white American males and may not apply to you or your culture, you likely have an approximate notion of what you consider comfortable interpersonal distances. Choosing the right focal length for portrait photography is straightforward. First, decide the approximate distance from which you feel people look their best. And second, select the focal length that produces the composition you want at that distance. So, if you prefer how people appear from longer distances and you favor tightly framed photographs that border on head and shoulder shots, your style calls for a medium or longer telephoto lens. Photographers who are partial to environmental portraiture, which showcases people in their usual environment, can combine a long subject distance with a wide-angle lens. The permutations are practically endless, so do what makes you happy. Keep in mind, if you discover a fondness for wide-angle close-scale portraits, it's important to know the ultimate purpose and audience for your photos. In a 2012 experiment about the effect of perspective distortion on social judgment, subjects were photographed simultaneously from two camera distances, 45 centimeters and 135 centimeters. Experimenters found that study participants preferred faces photographed from outside of the personal space more than those photographed from within it, and rated them higher for attractiveness, competence, and trustworthiness. So when you get an opportunity to take a picture of your favorite evil politician, take a note from Platon. Get close and shoot wide. This research was published in 2012, and mobile social media platforms have had years of explosive growth ever since. That means arm's-length portraits, selfies, of celebrities, public figures, and your secret crush are incredibly common and accessible, and provide the general public with constant exposure to examples of perspective distortion on conventionally attractive faces, which is something we weren't privy to more than a decade ago. One more thing. Telephoto lenses have a unique benefit over wide-angle lenses because their relatively narrower angle of view allows minute shifts in perspective to dramatically alter the photo's background. It's useful for removing parts of the background from the composition that you feel are distracting. Since short focal length lenses capture a wider angle of view, equally small movements from left to right, up and down won't accomplish the same goal. And there you have it, a guide for choosing your next portrait lens. Personally, my favorite lens for portraiture is the Fujifilm 56mm f1.2. It offers an angle of view equivalent to an 85mm lens on a full-frame camera. Features a very large f1.2 aperture, at which it's quite sharp, and has lovely bokeh. With that in mind, I've used this lens for many other subjects, ranging from still life, street scenes, and landscapes. This brings me to my final point. No matter what lens you buy, no matter what category of photography it's marketed towards, I encourage you to experiment using it on different subjects in a variety of settings. Always explore and discover, and don't put yourself in a box. If you have requests for future topics, let me know in the comments and I'll address them in future videos. In the meantime, you can learn more about photography on exposuretherapy.ca. See you next time.